Carhéirigh, and I want to thank and congratulate the Social Democrats for putting forward this motion, which the Labour Party will obviously be supporting. We absolutely reject the counter motion put down by the government, and I'll refer to that in a moment. I would like everybody, I suppose, listening to this debate to, pause for a second and realise where exactly we are. We're in the North Inner City. We're actually in the geographical birthplace of the workers' rights movement in Ireland. We're in the shadow of Liberty Hall. We're in walking distance of where Jim Larkin once spoke to striking dockers. You could take another trip down Henry Street and see the plaque where the Dunnes Stores women, predominantly women, went on strike in the 80s. But of course, this isn't a history lesson. As has been referenced, the Debenham workers are just one latest example of how the struggle for workers' rights continues. Now, I find the counter-motion or the amendment put down by government to be an insult. To what the Social Democrats are attempting to achieve, to be an insult to those who actually believe in workers' rights, to those who have struggled for long years to obtain workers' rights and to enshrine it in legislation. But I'm not surprised because the Taoiseach actually insulted myself, my party and our efforts to deal with the High Court judgment only yesterday, when he said that what we are engaging with was virtue signalling. Virtue signalling is what he said. And this is the same individual, the same minister, when launching his Fine Gael leadership campaign 3 years ago, said that he intended to introduce legislation to ban public sector workers from striking in essential services. This is the type of political ethic that we are dealing with the current minister. Now, that was enough to get some political support for his candidacy for the leadership of Fine Gael 3 years ago, and yet these are the same essential workers that he was happy to applaud during this pandemic, and to say that without them our country would have fallen apart. Classic dog whistling. Now, the Labour Party and other parties in the Oireachtas have gone to great lengths to introduce legislation which will improve the lot of workers in Ireland, which in recent years have been rejected by Fine Gael and by Fianna Fáil. I refer last year to the Joint Labour Committee Reform Bill put forward by then Senator Jed Nash, rejected by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. The bogus self-employment bill put forward in June 2019, which again was galling because government said at that time that they were going to introduce their own bogus self-employment legislation, and yet a year later there was no sign of it. But the issue there is that bogus self-employment actually cheats us all. So again, I go back to the minister's political ethic. When it comes to welfare, he's quite happy to put on the side of a bus, welfare cheat us all. Bogus self-employment costs this country hundreds of millions of euro a year because of PRSI, and yet nothing was done when it came to bogus self-employment and the legislation which we introduced, and a commitment that wasn't lived up to. Minister, I'll say this to you about workers' rights. We live in a low-pay, low-tax economy. We live in an economy where before COVID hit, 23% of Irish workers were in statistical low pay. That's an OECD figure. It is a scandal. It is a statistic that should shame us all. Because low pay, living on a low-paid wage, is humiliating. It grinds you down. It sucks itself into the marrow of your bones and could possibly stay with you for life. And as has been referred to my colleagues in the Social Democrats, it is disproportionately migrant workers, disproportionately women. And of course, it is naturally enough unprotected by collective bargaining rights. because we have some of the weakest collective bargaining rights in Europe. Because inevitably, an employer who has a veto on collective bargaining negotiations has no interest in lifting the 23% of our entire workforce who are in low pay. And it's not just a low pay issue, because in terms of young people, we have 40% of young people under 30 years of age are in insecure work. Now, if you have insecure employment, that leads to insecure accommodation, and leads to insecurity in huge areas of your life, including education prospects. And that's the economy in which government is telling us that we hope to return to. Now, I would suggest to you, Minister, with the greatest of respect to you and what you're trying to achieve, suggesting that welfare cheats us all, but bogus self-employment is not something that we need to worry about immediately, is wrong. I would suggest to you that anybody who stands in front of a microphone and says we have to introduce legislation to ban public sector workers from striking in essential services hasn't a clue what they're talking about, and shouldn't have the gall then, a number of years later, when they're saving lives, to applaud them. And I also want your government to recognise that we have a low-pay economy within which we need collective bargaining rights. Now, if it is unconstitutional to do so, as I'm quite sure your AG will tell you, well then let's have a constitutional referendum. Let's have a citizens' assembly, which you are justifiably organising for the drugs issue, for education. A task force has been recommended by the Social Democrats. I think we could go with that. And if a constitutional referendum is required to change the Constitution to allow for collective bargaining rights and to break the employer veto, then let's go with it. But I'll tell you this much, Minister. For the Taoiseach of the day and for the Minister in charge of this area to stand in Dáil Éireann and to accuse members of the Labour Party, or indeed any other party, of virtue signalling because we introduce legislation to protect those who need legislation, is beneath him, beneath his ministerial office, and beneath the dignity of this government, I feel, that people are looking to for help, support and protection. So this isn't virtue signalling what the Social Democrats are proposing today and what Sinn Féin and Labour and others are supporting. It's about workers' rights. It's the ongoing struggle. And I really wish and I really hope that the government will produce a much better thought-out counter-motion than the effective insult which they produced this evening.